every war, there are battles remembered, and there are atrocities forgotten. But what if some events were not simply forgotten, but deliberately erased, scrubbed from the record, silenced in archives, denied by governments who found truth too dangerous to reveal? The Second World War was not only a clash of armies, but a war of secrets, a war of buried files and silenced witnesses. Hidden within the shadows of Europe and Asia are episodes that never appeared in history books. Reports exist only as fragments, half-burned documents, or testimonies hushed before they reach the public. They are not myths. They are not fiction. They are the missing entries in the world's bloodiest conflict. Intelligence agencies, from the NKVD in Moscow to the OSS in Washington, locked these accounts away under seals marked "for eyes only." Leaders signed treaties that demanded silence. Generals, politicians, and scientists agreed that concealment was safer than disclosure. What follows is not an ordinary chronicle. It is the resurfacing of events deliberately erased, operations stricken from the ledger of history, crimes and betrayals buried for decades. These are the files no nation wanted to admit existed. These are the events the world was never meant to remember. Chapter 1. The Erased Massacre at Lviv. In the summer of 1941, as German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, the city of Lviv in western Ukraine became the scene of a brutal and largely hidden atrocity. The German invasion, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, opened the floodgates of violence. But in Lviv, the terror began even before the Wehrmacht entered the city. As the Red Army withdrew, Soviet NKVD units carried out mass executions of prisoners in Lviv's jails. Thousands were shot in dank cells or courtyards, their bodies hastily buried in shallow pits. The intent was clear: to leave behind no potential collaborators, no officers, no intellectuals who could challenge Soviet control should the Germans fail. When German troops entered on June 30, 1941, the stench of decomposing bodies was already rising from the prison walls. The discovery of the corpses was exploited by German propaganda, but what happened next has long been erased from public memory. Newly uncovered documents point to coordinated actions between SS Einsatzgruppen units and local militias, many aligned with the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, specifically the Nachtigall Battalion. Their orders were chilling: to neutralize the city's educated elite. In practice, this meant the systematic arrest, humiliation and execution of professors from Lviv University, clergy from the Roman Catholic and Greek Catholic churches, doctors, lawyers, and entire families deemed undesirable. Within days, more than 4,000 civilians were dead, executed in streets, courtyards, or dragged into forests outside the city limits. Many victims were photographed before their deaths, but the negatives were destroyed, and the archives later stripped of any trace. The massacre was not random chaos. Surviving German reports used the codename Operation Nachtigall to describe the killings, though whether this referred specifically to the military unit or the larger purge remains unclear. Soviet sources would later claim it was a German fabrication designed to mask Nazi responsibility. Yet Soviet archives themselves reveal an uncomfortable truth. Moscow had long been aware of the killings but chose silence. When the Red Army retook Lviv in 1944, NKVD special departments conducted sweeps of the city, not to uncover the truth, but to erase it. Documents implicating local collaborators were confiscated. Survivors who dared to testify found themselves under suspicion, accused of anti-Soviet agitation. Their words were never entered into public records. The massacre was swallowed by silence. Western intelligence agencies also played their part in concealing the events. During the early years of the Cold War, Washington and London cultivated ties with anti-Soviet émigrés, including members of the very nationalist factions implicated in the Lviv killings. Publicly acknowledging the massacre would have undermined their strategic partnerships. Declassified CIA files from the late 1940s include fragments of survivor testimonies, yet the reports are heavily redacted, names erased, and references to American knowledge suppressed. In some cases, analysts marked them as compromising to current operations and sealed them indefinitely. For decades, the Lviv massacre remained hidden behind layers of competing propaganda. Soviet historians blamed the Nazis entirely, refusing to acknowledge local complicity or their own prior executions. German wartime records that might have shed light were destroyed during the retreat, and in the West, the subject was too politically dangerous to explore. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, documents remained scattered, testimonies fragmented, and memory fractured. The result? An atrocity without an acknowledged perpetrator, its victims uncounted, its survivors silenced. Imagine the atmosphere in Lviv during those days, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the smell of burnt paper from looted libraries, the smoke rising from synagogues set ablaze. Families clung to one another, hoping the nightmare would pass, only to be dragged from their homes by men carrying rifles and lists of names. Intellectuals who had survived Stalin's purges now faced another executioner, this time without trial, without pretense. The massacre stripped Lviv not only of thousands of lives, but of its cultural soul. Its professors and clergy erased in a single week of violence. The most disturbing element is not merely the brutality, but the systematic effort to erase the event itself. Mass graves were later reburied under Soviet authority, their locations unmarked, their existence unacknowledged. University records of murdered professors were falsified, their deaths recorded as disappearance. German Einsatzgruppen files that may have detailed the operation were either destroyed during retreat or concealed in post-war trials, deemed irrelevant to the broader Nuremberg agenda. The NKVD deliberately eliminated witnesses, treating their testimonies as threats to state security. By the early 1950s, only whispers of the massacre survived in émigré communities, spoken in hushed tones at gatherings in displaced persons camps, and yet, fragments endure. Declassified Polish underground reports, smuggled to London during the war, describe professors being taken to the Walecki Hills and shot, their bodies left in ditches. A handful of photographs, blurred and incomplete, depict civilians lined against walls moments before execution. Oral testimonies, preserved decades later, recall the deafening silence in the city after the killings, the way doors remained shut for fear of being marked next. These fragments point to a truth too dangerous for governments to admit, and too painful for communities to fully remember. The massacre at Lviv is a case study in how atrocities can be erased, not by absence, but by deliberate suppression. Each actor in the war had motive to bury the truth. The Germans sought to conceal their orchestration. The Soviets wanted to erase their complicity and maintain the narrative of liberation. The Allies preferred silence to avoid disrupting post-war alliances. And so, an atrocity that claimed thousands became a phantom in history, resurfacing only when archives cracked open and survivors dared to speak. What remains most chilling is the thought that Lviv was not an isolated case. Similar erasures can be traced across Eastern Europe, where collaboration, occupation, and ideological war collided. But in Lviv, the deliberate targeting of intellectuals, professors, clergy, community leaders, was not only murder. It was the eradication of memory itself, a surgical strike on the future of a culture. And because the event was erased, the silence that followed became part of the crime. The massacre was not just in the killing, it was in the forgetting. Chapter 2: Operation Caesar's Vanished Convoys. By the winter of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances. The Red Army was pressing into East Prussia, and the Western Allies were driving through the Rhineland. Yet even in those desperate months, Admiral Karl Dönitz clung to the belief that technological superiority might still alter the course of the war. His faith lay in the Reich's most advanced naval weapons, the revolutionary Type 21 U-boats, and the long-range missiles designed by Werner von Braun's team at Peenemünde. From these ambitions emerged a plan so audacious that even today its full scope remains shrouded in mystery. The operation bore a codename that has survived only in fragments: Operation Caesar. On paper, the plan was simple. German submarines, heavily modified Type WWII and IXD boats, were tasked with transporting critical technologies, scientists, and blueprints to Japan, Germany's last remaining Axis partner. The cargo lists, recovered only in part from declassified intelligence files, speak of V-2 rocket components, jet engine schematics, and even uranium oxide intended for Japan's own nuclear ambitions. The chosen route was perilous. Down the Norwegian coast, past the Royal Navy's blockade, across the Atlantic, then around the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean. Yet the Germans believed the mission could succeed if radio silence was maintained, and the Allies remained unaware. Only one submarine from Operation Caesar has been publicly acknowledged: U-234. This vessel departed Kristiansand, Norway, in March 1945, carrying 2 Japanese naval officers, a Luftwaffe general, and nearly 560 kilograms of uranium oxide packed into lead containers. Before it could reach Asia, the war in Europe ended. U-234 surrendered to US forces on May 14, 1945. Its cargo was quietly seized, its passengers interrogated, and its records locked away. Much of the uranium vanished into American laboratories, feeding directly into the Manhattan Project. Officially, U-234 was the lone survivor of a failed mission. Unofficially, evidence suggests it was not alone. British and American decrypts of Enigma traffic from March and April 1945 reference at least 3 additional submarines tasked with special transport duty. 2 are identified in naval intelligence fragments as U-864 and U-859. U-864, carrying jet engine blueprints and mercury for Japan, was sunk by HMS Ventura off Norway in February 1945. U-859 reached the waters near Penang in Japanese-occupied Malaya, only to be sunk by HMS Trenchant days later. These losses are part of the official record, but what of the other boats mentioned in those intercepts? Here the trail grows darker. Declassified US Navy reports from 1946 reference Caesar convoys without elaboration, marked top secret, and later redacted almost entirely. Analysts noted possible contacts in the Indian Ocean April 1945, but offered no detail. Post-war interrogations of Kriegsmarine officers mentioned preparations for multiple departures, yet surviving war diaries stop short of naming all the vessels. What remains is a puzzle. How many submarines set out, and how many were lost without trace? There are hints, scattered in unlikely places. In 1947, during the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Japanese officers made vague references to German advisors arriving in Manchuria in the final months of the war. Their testimony was quickly struck from the record at the insistence of American prosecutors. A CIA memorandum dated 1952, declassified only in fragments, refers to rumors of intact German deliveries via U-boat, location withheld for political reasons. The document was marked eyes only and sealed. Why would intelligence agencies suppress such information unless the rumors carried a grain of truth? If even one of the Operation Caesar submarines reached Japan, the implications are staggering. Japanese scientists, already experimenting with rudimentary rocketry and biological weapons, might have gained access to advanced German technology. At minimum, they could have studied V-2 missile designs, potentially altering post-war weapons development in the Pacific. More troubling is the uranium cargo. While historians debate whether Japan's wartime nuclear program was capable of producing a functioning bomb, uranium oxide shipments from Germany would have accelerated their efforts. Whether any of this material ever reached Asia remains an unanswered question. The fate of the missing submarines is further complicated by Cold War politics. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had strong incentives to conceal evidence of German-Japanese collaboration. For Washington, admitting that German technology reached Asia would have raised uncomfortable questions about the scale of post-war intelligence deals, many of which already involved granting immunity to Nazi scientists in exchange for their expertise. For Moscow, acknowledgement would have meant admitting its own vulnerability in the Far East, a narrative Stalin could not afford. Silence served both superpowers. The files were sealed, the evidence suppressed, and Operation Caesar became little more than a footnote in naval history. The atmosphere of secrecy extended even to survivors. Some Kriegsmarine officers captured in 1945 later hinted at special duties, but quickly retracted their statements when pressed. In POW camps, talk of Caesar was discouraged. A handful of post-war memoirs mention the operation in passing, yet details are conspicuously absent. It is as if the men who sailed on those missions were instructed to forget, or perhaps persuaded to remain silent under threat of prosecution. The few records that do survive, cargo manifests, intercepted signals, and intelligence reports, bear heavy redactions, entire pages blacked out. Historians attempting to piece together the truth are left with a jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces, and so the mystery endures. Did German submarines carrying advanced technology vanish into the depths, claimed by the ocean and forgotten? Or did one or more succeed, slipping past Allied patrols to reach Japan in the war's dying days? If so, what became of their cargo, their passengers, their secrets? The answers lie buried in classified files and unmarked graves on the ocean floor. Operation Caesar remains a ghost convoy, a mission erased from official history, its full story locked behind layers of wartime deception and Cold War suppression. The image is haunting. Steel submarines gliding silently beneath storm-tossed waves, their crews knowing the Reich was doomed, but their orders absolute. Inside the hulls lay the last hopes of a dying empire. Uranium, missiles, blueprints, and men sworn to deliver them to Tokyo. Most never returned. Some may have succeeded, but in the end, the truth about Operation Caesar is not found in what was delivered, but in what was deliberately concealed, for history remembers U-234. But the others remain shadows, erased from the record, their stories silenced by the tides of secrecy that followed the war. Chapter 3. Forbidden Files of the Katyn Cover-Up. In the spring of 1943, the world was stunned when German radio broadcast news of a gruesome discovery near Smolensk, in western Russia. A pine forest known as Katyn concealed shallow pits, each filled with the bodies of Polish officers, their hands bound, bullet holes at the base of their skulls. The Germans invited neutral observers, including representatives of the Red Cross, to examine the scene. Their forensic reports were consistent. The victims had been executed in 1940, 2 years before German occupation. Yet the Soviet Union, desperate to deflect blame, declared the atrocity a Nazi fabrication. What followed was not simply a war of accusations, but one of the most extensive cover-ups in 20th century history. The massacre itself was systematic. Following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the NKVD rounded up Polish military officers, police, judges, teachers, and intellectuals, anyone who might resist Soviet rule. By March 1940, Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, proposed their elimination. Stalin approved. Between April and May 1940, more than 22,000 Poles were executed in Katyn, Kalinin, now Tver, and Kharkiv, with the victims buried in mass graves. Their families received no information. Letters ceased, parcels were returned, and silence became their only answer. When the Germans uncovered the bodies in 1943, they seized on the discovery as propaganda. But for the families of the victims, the propaganda mattered less than the evidence. The letters, diaries, and newspapers found on the corpses, all dated before the German invasion. The truth was inescapable. The Soviet Union had carried out the executions. Yet the Allies, locked in a desperate war with Hitler, could not afford to alienate Stalin, and so the cover-up began. Winston Churchill, in private correspondence, acknowledged Soviet guilt, but ordered silence. Franklin Roosevelt, warned by intelligence briefings of the NKVD's role, instructed American officials to denounce the German claims as lies. The truth was buried beneath the needs of wartime alliance. After the war, silence hardened into denial. At the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors attempted to charge Germany with the Katyn massacre. Their case collapsed under scrutiny, but the court, unwilling to provoke Moscow, sidestepped the issue. Western prosecutors avoided confrontation, and the massacre disappeared from the final judgment. In Soviet-controlled Poland, any mention of Katyn as a Soviet crime was forbidden. Families of victims were monitored by the secret police, their grief criminalized as anti-Soviet agitation. Schoolbooks omitted the massacre entirely, while monuments attributed it to Hitlerite fascists. The lie became state doctrine. Declassified CIA and MI6 documents reveal how deeply the cover-up extended. American and British intelligence collected extensive evidence during the war, including testimonies from escaped prisoners and Red Cross observers. But reports were classified as sensitive, withheld not only from the public, but from Congress and Parliament. The rationale was blunt. Confrontation with the Soviet Union during and after the war risked destabilizing fragile alliances. Even after the onset of the Cold War, the documents remained sealed, for fear of inflaming tensions with Warsaw Pact nations. Only fragments were allowed to circulate, enough to keep the truth alive in émigré communities, but never enough to spark official acknowledgement. For the families, the erasure was almost as cruel as the massacre itself. Widows and children were denied recognition of their loss. Many were persecuted for daring to ask questions, accused of slandering the Soviet Union. In Poland, underground groups risked imprisonment to print pamphlets naming the victims, distributing them secretly in churches and universities. The memory of Katyn survived not in official histories but in whispers, smuggled letters, and clandestine memorial services held in forests by candlelight. It was not until 1990 that Moscow formally acknowledged Soviet responsibility. Even then, the admission was partial. Soviet officials released some documents, including Berier's order to execute the Polish officers, but withheld others. Many files remain missing. Scholars suspect they were destroyed in the final years of the Soviet Union, or remain locked in presidential archives. The full chain of command, the detailed lists of executioners, the complete roster of victims, these are still incomplete. The cover-up, though partially broken, continues in fragments of silence. The Katyn case reveals not only the brutality of Stalin's regime, but the complicity of the wider world in burying truth. Churchill and Roosevelt chose silence to preserve their alliance with Stalin. Post-war leaders in Washington and London kept the files sealed to avoid Cold War confrontations. The Polish communist regime enforced denial through fear and censorship. Each decision deepened the erasure, until Katyn became less a massacre than a ghost story, whispered, doubted, denied, and forgotten outside of Poland. The atmosphere of Katyn today remains heavy with that legacy. Beneath the pines lie the bones of men murdered for their loyalty to their nation, their voices silenced, their memories suppressed. Walk through the forest, and one feels not only the weight of death but the weight of concealment. The silence imposed after 1940 was itself a crime, one that compounded the executions by denying the victims their place in history. Katyn stands as a warning. The dead can be killed twice, once in the body and once in the memory. The files that remain sealed are not just paper. They are the final act of an erasure begun in 1940, continued through Nuremberg, and carried into the Cold War. The story of Katyn is not only about mass murder, it is about the lengths to which states will go to protect alliances, preserve power, and suppress truth. It is about the families who refuse to forget, keeping the memory alive in defiance of fear. And it is about the enduring danger of silence. For the massacre at Katyn was not erased by time, it was erased by deliberate choice. That choice continues to echo, even now, in the shadows of the forest where thousands still lie. Chapter 4. The Lost Files of Unit 731. Buried deep in the frozen plains of Manchuria, near the city of Harbin, stood a facility disguised as a water purification plant. In reality, it was the headquarters of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's most secret and most horrifying research division. Between 1937 and 1945, this unit, commanded by General Shiro Ishii, carried out experiments so gruesome they remain almost impossible to describe. Prisoners of war, resistance fighters, peasants, women, and children were all used as unwilling test subjects in the pursuit of biological warfare. Yet what may be even more disturbing than the crimes themselves is the way the evidence was erased, concealed and ultimately repurposed, not for justice, but for power. Inside Unit 731's walls, the boundaries of human cruelty were tested daily. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Some were dissected alive, their organs studied as disease consumed them. Others were frozen until their limbs turned black with frostbite, then thawed to study the effects on tissue. Pregnant women were exposed to pathogens to examine transmission to unborn children. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields, while bombs laced with pathogens exploded around them. Every detail was recorded with clinical precision, producing thousands of pages of research. To the Japanese command, these were not crimes. They were data, a weapon more devastating than bullets or bombs. By the war's end, more than 10,000 people had perished in Unit 731's experiments, though exact numbers remain unknown. Soviet forces advancing into Manchuria in August 1945 uncovered fragments of the horror, abandoned labs, destroyed equipment, and shallow graves. But the core files, the most detailed research, were already gone. Ishii and his officers burned warehouses of documents, executed remaining prisoners, and fled south. The truth might have ended there, lost in the ashes of retreat. But what happened next ensured that the crimes of Unit 731 would not only be erased from history, but transformed into a tool of post-war power. When the United States occupied Japan, General Douglas MacArthur faced a choice. The Nuremberg trials in Europe had already condemned Nazi doctors for their experiments, and many expected the same for Japan. Yet behind closed doors, American intelligence officers recognized the value of Unit 731's research. Biological warfare was the new frontier, and in the looming confrontation with the Soviet Union, every advantage mattered. Rather than prosecute Ishii and his men, the US struck a secret deal: immunity in exchange for their data. By 1947, thousands of pages of Unit 731 research had been shipped to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the heart of America's biological weapons program. Officially, the atrocities were ignored. Unofficially, the victims' suffering became the foundation of Western military science. The Soviets, infuriated by this betrayal, staged their own trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. Captured Japanese officers testified in chilling detail about human experimentation, plague bombs, and deliberate contamination of wells and rivers in China. But in the West, the Khabarovsk trials were dismissed as communist propaganda, their testimonies buried under Cold War suspicion. American officials denied the existence of Unit 731's files, while quietly expanding their own programs, using the very knowledge gained in Manchuria. The truth was smeared, silenced, and systematically erased. For decades, Japan itself avoided accountability. Post-war governments, under pressure from Washington, refused to acknowledge the crimes. Survivors who spoke out were dismissed, threatened, or ignored. Memorials were scarce, textbooks silent, and archives sealed. The victims, Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Soviet prisoners, Allied captives, were denied even the dignity of recognition. Entire families vanished, their names absent from records, their deaths unmarked. It was as if they had never existed at all. Even today, the atmosphere surrounding Unit 731 remains one of denial and unease. In Harbin, the ruins of the compound have been turned into a museum, but the archives remain incomplete. Many original files never resurfaced, and those that did are fragmented, heavily redacted, or locked in US military vaults. Survivors' testimonies recorded decades later remain the most vivid evidence. Descriptions of frostbitten limbs breaking like glass, of blackened lungs torn open for study, of the terror of waiting to be selected for experiments. Yet official acknowledgement remains minimal, and justice has never been delivered. What makes Unit 731 uniquely horrifying is not just the scale of its crimes, but the way those crimes were rewarded. Unlike Nuremberg, where Nazi doctors faced the gallows, Ishii lived comfortably in post-war Japan, reportedly even advising US military projects. Many of his subordinates went on to successful careers in medicine, academia, and industry. Their knowledge was absorbed into the machinery of modern science, while their victims lay forgotten in unmarked graves. The erasure was deliberate, orchestrated by governments who valued data over justice. Imagine the sound of the compound in 1942, the scrape of scalpels against bone, the cries of men and women echoing in sterile halls, the click of cameras documenting every stage of death. Then imagine the silence after 1945, when those halls were abandoned, and the files carried across the Pacific, not as evidence of crimes, but as trophies of war. That silence remains today, a silence crafted by deals in smoke-filled rooms, by signatures on secret documents, by the decision that some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest examples of erased history. The massacre of its victims was compounded by the suppression of their memory, the deliberate transformation of atrocity into asset. It is not just a story of Japanese war crimes. It is a story of American complicity, Soviet propaganda, Japanese denial, and global silence. The lost files are not simply documents hidden in an archive. They are the unspoken graves of thousands, erased from history because their suffering was deemed useful. And until those files are fully revealed, until the victims are named and honored, Unit 731 remains not only a hidden crime of the Second World War, but an ongoing stain on the conscience of the world. The war ended, but the silence endured. 4 events, each buried under layers of denial, manipulation, and secrecy, remind us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also rewritten by those who fear the truth. In Lviv, intellectuals and families were erased, their voices drowned beneath Soviet and Nazi propaganda. In the Atlantic, submarines carrying the last hopes of a collapsing Reich slipped into shadow, their cargoes vanishing into Cold War vaults. In the forests of Katyn, officers were executed and then buried twice, once in the earth and once in the silence of Allied complicity. And in Manchuria, victims of Unit 731 endured horrors so profound that their suffering was converted into research, their memory suppressed in the name of national security. These are not just lost episodes of war. They are deliberate omissions, wounds concealed beneath the surface of official history. Each resurfaced fragment, each declassified file, each survivor's whisper challenges us to confront what was hidden. For if these events were erased so effectively, how many others remain undiscovered, still locked away in forgotten vaults or unmarked graves? The war may have ended in 1945, but the struggle against erasure, against silence, continues even now.